Welcome everyone. Thanks for bearing with us with the technologies and such like. Pleased that you could all make it, and I hope we're going to have a really good discussion tonight. We've certainly got some excellent people come to address us. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional country across our region, acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kabi Kabi, Jinabara and Turrbal traditional custodians and their elders past, present and emerging. So we're here to consider climate emergency declarations. What is their purpose? How can they support local climate action? I hope that by the end of the evening we know and feel equipped to do more in our little patch of the planet to be able to find a future for humanity. I should have perhaps introduced myself. Did I introduce myself? Will Parker on behalf of Moreton Climate Action now. We're affiliated to the Queensland Conservation Council. We're just looking at working with the local community, trying to engage in where we live, where we work, just finding our way to help our leaders by showing that we're keen for change. We want to make a change in our area. It's where we've grown up. It's where our children are growing up. So perhaps without further ado, because we're running a little bit late, I would like to introduce Professor Brendon Mackey, Director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon. Brendon has a PhD in ecology from the Australian National University, and Brendon is coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2, Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation. So please to introduce you.
Asked to talk to you about key messages from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, recent reports, and discuss some of the implications for the scale and speed of societal climate action that the science is now saying is required. And I'm going to be drawing upon the findings from the most recent IPCC 6th assessment report. These happen every 7 years, they're major events. The IPCC organises itself into 3 working groups. The report from Working Group 1 looks at the physical basis of climate change, what the observed changes in the climate system are, how we know that's due to human influence, and what the models are projecting for future climate given different emission scenarios. Working Group 2, for which I was a coordinating lead author, looks at the impacts of climate change, both the observed impacts and projected ones. Adaptation, which is what we have to do to change to address those risks and impacts, and the vulnerability of our human and natural systems to those impacts. Working Group 3 looks at how we can mitigate climate change, and that is really referring to how we can avoid and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are the root cause of the problem here. A couple of points to note about the IPCC assessment process. We assessed what is documented in the peer-reviewed scientific publications and other authoritative reports, such as by CSIRO and BOM, about these 3 issues, and I'm mainly drawing upon Working Group 1 and 2 findings. So it follows that if the research has not been undertaken and published, then it cannot be assessed and reported. So there's certainly gaps in our knowledge. And the absence of research on a topic does not mean there is no observed impact or future risk. It just means that no one studied it. So I would argue or suggest that our findings, IPCC findings, are conservative in that respect. And as I said, I was a coordinating lead author in Working Group 2, Impacts Vulnerability and Impacts Adaptation and Vulnerability. There are two main reports. One is on the right-hand side, it's called the Summary for Policymakers. It's a high-level synthesis of the full report. It's actually co-penned by authors and government representatives because it's translating the science into policy relevant key messages that are consistent with the evidence. And that's about 30 odd pages long, and it's certainly written to be accessible to any and all interested parties. The full report is really the in-depth scientific assessment. Our report for Working Group 2 is 3,600 pages long. It involved 270 authors from 67 countries who collectively assessed 34,000 scientific publications. And the report itself undergoes a very extensive global open peer review process, actually through 3 versions. And there were about 62,500 review comments that were received, and each one of them was responded to. So the findings that are presented in the full report and in the Summary for Policymakers are the result of a rigorous process and are evidence-based. There's even a chapter that in our report that provides a comprehensive assessment for Australia and New Zealand. We looked at the observed and projected impacts on natural human systems, including different sectors such as the agricultural sector, but also natural ecosystems and infrastructure, health sector. We looked at vulnerabilities, which for natural systems is often due to their pre-existing conditions and natural sensitivities. For example, tropical coral reefs are very sensitive to marine heat waves. For social factors, the vulnerability is often a function of societal inequalities. We looked at, as I mentioned, different economic sectors and communities, including Indigenous peoples, and we identified 9 key risks, including 2 new climate risk categories I'm going to speak about. We looked at our progress and capacity and the enablers and limits for adaptation, and discussed all of this by way of conclusion in the concept of what the IPCC refers to as climate resilient development, how we can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to the impacts and risks, and promote sustainable development. Let me say something about this concept of global warming. We hear about it a lot. We talk about how the international community has agreed to try and limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. And people often say to me, well, 1.5 degrees isn't much, why should we worry about that? Well, the thing to keep in mind, because I'm going to be referring to global warming a lot in this presentation, is that it's an index. It's referring to the average planetary surface temperature now compared to what it was in pre-industrial era, which is about 1850. So you can think of it much like a thermometer reading of Earth's health. So we know that for a healthy adult, a safe average body temperature is about 36 to 37 degrees, that 38 degrees is diagnostic of a fever, and 40 degrees Celsius is life-threatening. So by analogy, a healthy body temperature for Earth is actually 0. It's 0 degrees above pre-industrial level. We're currently, and we're above that now. How much more are we above? Well, we're currently at 1.1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, which is, I would argue, equivalent of a planetary fever, because 0 is our healthy reference temperature. And above 1.5 degrees Celsius, as I'll explain, is kind of equivalent of life-threatening. So this is a really important point. Every increment of global warming, every 0.1 of an increase in the average annual daily global surface temperature compared to pre-industrial levels results in an increase, a worsening of climate impacts and risks. So even a 0.1 degree warming is, indicates a huge change in the climate system. So as I said, we're currently experiencing 1.1 degrees, and the bad news is there's another 0.4 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels locked in, and it's likely to be reached by about 2030. So we're heading to 1.5 degrees by 2030, 2040. Actually, the latest estimates are it'll actually be in 8 to 10 years' time, so closer to 2030. What happens after that entirely depends upon our level, or largely depends upon our level of mitigation ambition and implementation of those that mitigation commitments, because this will determine if global warming is capped at 1.5 degrees or if warming continues. And that's because the level of warming is related to the accumulated stock of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, which is mainly the additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from humans burning fossil fuel and deforestation and degradation. So if we mitigate those greenhouse gases, if we avoid emitting them and reduce how much we emit them sufficiently, we can limit global warming to 1.5. The graph on the right shows you degrees of global warming on the left-hand side and along the bottom time from 1950 to projected into the future. The grey or the black line in the graph is the actual observed level of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And the colours indicate possible levels of warming depending upon our level of mitigation ambition and the implementation of that ambition. The blue indicates what's possible if we were to be highly ambitious now and aggressively reduce our emissions. And if we look, and there's a range above that, but and I'll talk a bit about this graph a bit later in my presentation, because it's very interesting to consider what the current level of mitigation ambition is and where on that graph we're now likely to fall. So as I said, the level of climate risk, but also our adaptive capacity scales with global warming. And these are some of the key risks that we identified, climate risks we identified for Australia. And it's a complex graph, so I'll spend a little bit of time explaining it. There's a pair of bar graphs for each of these key risks, and we refer to them as burning ember diagrams. So if we look at the top left one, loss and degradation of coral reefs in Australia, and you can see the levels of global warming on the left-hand side, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The colour indicates the level of risk. White is undetectable, yellow is moderate, red is high, and purple is very high. And there are two bars. One is for low adaptation and the other is for a moderate level of adaptation. And you can see for our coral reefs, our tropical coral reefs, we're already at a very high risk of loss and degradation. And this is because they're already experiencing multiple marine heat waves which cause coral bleaching. And you can see there's very little adaptation we can do to manage that risk, to lower that risks. So 1.5 degrees is really quite catastrophic for tropical coral reefs. If we look down at the bottom, we can see a different kind of scenario. If we look at that one kind of in the middle at the bottom, disruption, decline in agricultural production in southern and eastern Australia. This is happening because we're seeing a decline in winter rainfall, and this is our winter crop zone for wheat and canola and the like. And you can see that under, currently we're at a moderate level of risk. There is a discernible drop in production potential that's due to that drop in winter rainfall. But agriculture is a highly adaptive sector. There's a lot we can do to moderate the impacts of climate change. And so our adaptive capacity is much higher because there's a lot more influence humans can have on what we grow and where we grow it and how we grow it. So we can see we really have to get well above 2 degrees before we're in a very high risk scenario. Similarly, on that right-hand side, we've got an increase in heat-related mortality. And some of you may know that the largest cause of death from natural disasters in Australia by order of magnitude is heat wave, heat-related mortality from heat waves. And again, we currently have moderate risk. At 2 degrees, we have higher risk, and at 3 degrees, it's very high. And again, that's because there's a lot we can do to moderate the impact of heat waves on people. We can have better insulated houses, better designed houses that are naturally better cooling. People can change the time of day they work outdoors, etc. So there are risks, but we can adapt. So we can see that some of our natural systems are at a high risk now, and above 1.5 degrees at a very high risk. And while some of the human systems that we're concerned with, there are still risks, but we have more adaptive capacity. But basically, if we allow global warming to get above 2.5 degrees, well, with every increment of warming, the risk increases in every sector. And above 2.5 degrees, we're basically at very high risk for everything. Here are 2 more risks that are now evident in Australia and in fact throughout the world. And on the left, they're featured on the left. And they're called cascading impacts on cities and settlements in Australia and New Zealand, and the failure of institutions and governance systems to manage climate risk. And Eastern and Southern Australia has experienced that since 2019 and is currently doing it in many parts of Southern Australia, in bucket loads. By cascading impacts, we can think about the flow-on effects of the mega fires we had in 2019 and 2020. Not only did 15 million hectares of forest and woodland burn and 1 billion wildlife animals die, but residents and holidaymakers were evacuated by the Navy off Malakuta Beach, and 300 people died of smoke-related respiratory illnesses in our major urban cities. So these are cascading impacts that propagate through and across sectors. And we also saw, in relation to the bushfires and the floods in February, a failure of institutional and governance systems to manage these mega events. So again, I'm just stressing, with every increment of global warming, the impacts and risks are greater, and where we land in terms of global warming depends upon our success or failure to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So what have we observed in Australia? Well, by observed, I mean we're comparing how the climate is now to how it was when we started taking meteorological records in Australia, which was around 1900, some records go back to 1900, a little bit earlier, some start around 1910, but basically the start of the 1900s. And here are the observed trends. These are not projections, these are not models. This is what's in the data recorded by the Bureau of Meteorology. We've seen further warming, rising temperatures, and sea level rise everywhere. We're experiencing more hot days and heat waves, less snow. Rainfall is much more complex. There's actually more rainfall in the north, less winter rainfall in the southwest and southeast, and more extreme fire weather days in the south and east. So that is the impact in Australia, the observed impact that we're now experiencing from 1.1 degree of global warming. And you can see on this graph, which is all of Australia's annual surface temperature, again, it's a very coarse index, you can see that where Australia is experiencing more than the global 1.1, it's more like 1.4, and it's really kicked off since the 1950s to 1970s. And this is where we're seeing the big changes. It's the big changes in the climatic record since the 60s and 70s, where things are really starting to take off. Now, the other major finding from our report for Australia was that these climate trends I just referred to have exacerbated extreme weather events. So we've recorded now an increase in the frequency and or severity and or duration of all extreme weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, and bushfires. And these have impacted on production landscapes. They've caused death and injuries and affected many households, communities, and businesses via their impacts on ecosystems, critical infrastructure, essential services, food production, the national economy, valued places, and employment. So when we talk about climate change impacts, yes, it's these slow, ongoing climate trends that we record differences in comparing decade to decade, but we're now experiencing an increase in extreme weather events. That is now part of the climate change story, scientific story. We've seen changing flood risks. So extreme high rain, i.e. heavy rainfall events, has increased and is projected to become more intense with every increment of global warming. As we saw in northern rivers, New South Wales, we've experienced these unprecedented landscape collapse events. We know that pluvial flood risk will increase in cities, urban areas, and small catchments. Flood response in rural areas will track changes to these high extreme rainfall, but obviously also depends upon the antecedent catchment conditions and water infrastructure. So that's one of the issues we're facing in the second half of this year. We've already had a really wet start to this year. We've got a third La Nina coming. The catchments many of the catchments are already wet. The reservoirs are all wet, full. The wetlands are wet, and we're going to see likely to see more flooding. And our adaptation to these changing flooding risks is currently mostly reactive and incremental in response to floods. We've also seen an increase in dangerous fire weather and bush maps, which is what this map shows. It shows the change in the number of dangerous fire weather days compared to the 1970s. This is largely due to a decline in winter rainfall in southern Australia, but also actually eastern Australia, and increasingly high temperatures in spring and summer. So over the last 50 years, we've seen a major increase in the frequency and severity of dangerous bushfire conditions, particularly in southern East Australia, including a lengthening of the fire season. So what are we going to do about it? This is where adaptation comes in, and this requires understanding our climate risks. So when we talk about climate risk, and this is what this diagram illustrates, it's an IPCC diagram that I've modified to be relevant to thinking about local government scale and local community impacts. So the impacts from climate change, which, as we know, as well as the climate trends, include wildfire, drought, flood, tropical cyclones, coastal flooding and erosion. These bring risks to built natural assets, community well-being, and other functions like the service delivery and infrastructure usability. And that risk can be understood as a result of three interacting factors. First of all is the climate hazard. Are we talking about a heat wave? Are we talking about a bushfire? Are we talking about a wildfire or flood? Or is it a drought? What kind of climate hazard is it? And depending on what our focus is, what's the vulnerability of that system to that hazard? As I said, this invokes issues such as how sensitive is the thing of value or of interest to that hazard. In terms of heat waves, if you're an outdoor worker, if you're an old person or a baby, you are more sensitive to heat waves than a young, healthy, fit person, for example. And this concept of adaptive capacity, what's our social capital and financial resources that enable us to change what we do and to protect our assets and community well-being. The other factor here is the exposure, and this is often a factor of the geographic location of the assets and communities in relation to the hazards. Obviously, you're only going to be exposed to coastal flooding and erosion if you live and work or have an asset in the coastal zone. So when we talk about climate risks, we're talking about the impacts to things that we value. I've got to consider what the hazard is, how vulnerable we are to that hazard, and whether we're exposed to it or not. But and these risks are increasingly complex. As I said, they're increasing in frequency and severity. There are cascading impacts on people, economic activities, ecosystems, and species. That's what that diagram, shows on the right. Is from our report. The mega fire event had these cascading impacts on human health, on agriculture, on wildlife, on ecosystem services. People died, and there was even air pollution all the way across in New Zealand, and economic and asset damage. But because we're now getting increasingly multiple extremes happening, accentuated by climate change, the impacts from fires, flood, droughts, and heat waves on settlements, infrastructure, supply chains, and ecosystems is increasingly compounding and aggregating. I.e., we're not recovering from one event when another one happens, then we're getting multiple events either in short periods of time. We're also seeing rapidly changing coastal dynamics and impacts from rising sea levels, a higher base level, and for waves, increases storm surges and impact of king tides. We're seeing shifting currents and wave patterns, which is changing erosion and inundation, different parts of the country experiencing shoreline recession. And in the coastal places like the Gold Coast illustrated here, which has a fairly narrow coastal zone with a high rainfall zone in the hinterland, the coastal processes are interacting with inland flooding to quite devastating effects at times. So, one of our big conclusions is we need a step change, much greater focus and investment in adaptation, and we need to be doing it now. And when we talk about adapting to climate risks and impact, it's really a process that includes doing a risk assessment, understanding the hazards and the vulnerability, identifying the different kind of strategies and options that are open, building this into our planning, our strategic planning and operational planning at a local government level, implementing those plans. And we need to be monitoring and evaluating and reviewing whether those adaptations are working or not. So I'm suggesting that the scale and scope of cascading, compounding, aggregating impacts requires new, larger scale and more timely adaptation. Current adaptation is largely incremental and reactive to events. We need to shift to what we call transformative and proactive adaptation. We need to be monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of our adaptation, and continually adjusting is critical because of shifting climatic regimes. We've got ongoing global warming, so the climate risk will be changing. And we need to be thinking about adaptation decision pathways and tipping points and turning points where because of our monitoring, we see that circumstances have changed. You might have a new climate hazard or it's increased in severity, and we need a different kind of adaptation. But if we do this, there are many environmental, social, and economic positives from it. So, taking on board this challenge of adapting to climate risk, it can generate many major co-benefits. It can help address existing social vulnerabilities. It can actually generate some economic benefits as well as avoiding costs from impacts. So let me just come back to what I referred to as the mitigation adaptation nexus that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, where I said every level of global warming represents an increase in the severity of the risks, climate risks and impacts. We have another 0.5 degree locked in, and it would appear. And whether how much we go above that depends on what we start doing now in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a complicated graph, But to cut a long story short, we are currently emitting, the world community, collectively, humans are emitting about 36.5 gigatons of carbon. That unit there is GTCO2-E. It's billions of tons of carbon dioxide. It says carbon dioxide E stands for equivalent, because there are some other greenhouse gases like methane. But we add them all together and convert them to CO2 equivalent. So think of it as 36.5 billion tons of CO2 annually. Well, there's only, as I said, the level of global warming is correlated with how much CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere. So there's what's called a global carbon budget. For a given level of global warming, you can only have a certain stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And we've nearly, and if we want to limit global warming, to below 2 degrees, right, to be somewhere close to 1.5 or 2 degrees, given that we're currently emitting 36.5 billion tons of CO2, we've only got somewhere between 8 to 20 years before the global carbon budget is expended. Now I say 8 to 20 because, being scientific and because we've got models which are projecting the future, there's uncertainty. So we give a range of values, but we've only got, a handful of years to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions if we want to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and close to 1 degree. So that's the main message here. So where are we at? Well, unfortunately, there's what's called a growing mitigation gap. As I just said, reducing the climate risks would require significant and rapid emissions to keep global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And we also need robust and timely adaptation. Now, this thermometer graph on the left is illustrating an analysis of all the mitigation pledges made by all the governments of the world and what that would deliver in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and what that in turn would mean in terms of global warming. So the main point from that graph is, if the governments were to implement all the mitigation pledges they're formally made, that would still deliver about 2.5 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. So if you think back to the climate risks, those burning ember diagrams I showed you before, I pointed out that if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we avoid a lot of the impacts and risks, and we stay within the adaptive capacity for most natural and human systems. Once we get around 2 degrees and over 2 degrees, certainly 2.5 degrees, we've actually exceeded the adaptive capacity of most systems, and every system is at high risk. So we're currently not there yet. We have what's called a growing mitigation gap. So I'm suggesting that people have called it the race to 2030 is now on. And in the coming years, governments are going to be looking to achieve deep and rapid cuts in emissions from all sectors. So that's why, from a scientific perspective, it is valid to talk about us having a climate crisis, because now is the time for mitigation and adaptation action. Thank you, and I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
G'day everyone. Yeah, I'm a Sanford resident. I've been there about 7 years or so. It's a great place to be, and I won't spend too much time because I'd like to open this up to the Q&A, because it's great having everybody come here, and I think we've got a phenomenal collection of expertise, presenting, but also in the room, and I think there's a couple of things that I wanted to cover today. So just to give you a bit of a sort of a 101, it's really important to understand, I think, when you're looking at climate-related risk. So a lot of the work I do is around climate-related risk and helping organisations to mainstream that risk into the organisation, or mainstream the understanding of the risk, but also, importantly, the flip side of risk is opportunity. So you need to understand your risk, but there are significant opportunities in this space, and also ancillary benefits. Now, Brendon and many of those before spoke about the physical risks, which are the acute and chronic risks. Often we see it from extreme events. There was a bit of a conversation as well going on with the range of risks associated, say, with our governance systems, that might cascade because of disruption. But it's also really, really important to recognise. So we need to transition at a rapid pace. So they're talking about declaring a climate change emergency. Well, what that means globally, so nationally, globally, but also at that local level, is actually a step change in our actions and what we do. And when you do that, there's actually a risk involved in that process. So there is going to be disruption. It's going to be disruption both from the physical side, that's what we're experiencing now, and to what extent that unpacks is largely dependent on the global response to climate change. A lot of the work that I work in at the moment is in transition risks, and that is transitioning to a low carbon resilient economy. So undertaking that steep dive in putting the handbrake on carbon does upset the apple cart. And so organisations must be aware of that, and they must be prepared to respond to that. So the types of risk that manifest in that case is, number one, is policy. So that's if the new government comes out and they call it stroke of the pen risk, overnight say thou must do X, then you haven't had much time to prepare for that. The other one is legal, so there's litigation risk associated. In Australia, I think we're a ticking time bomb around that litigation risk. After the Black Saturday bushfires, there's been in excess of $2 billion worth of litigation. The Crown's picked up the tab for some of that. The settlements out of court were in excess of $750 million. So we're looking at a high cat level impact. There's technology risk, so we need to rely on a significant amount of technology, but we don't have time to test some of that technology, so that's going to be a problem. Market risk is one that's absolutely real now, that will have a raft of challenges for councils. And market risk is, how does the market respond to both the transition and the physical impact? So in Australia, I think the most significant market risk that we are yet to see, so often people talk about insurance, and north of Bundaberg you can't get insurance for tropical cyclone, for example, but there are other things that you will soon struggle to get insurance for. Now that's one issue. The issue that I think is a sleeper that's about to rear its head is risk to mortgage portfolios. So I work with banks, I work in the finance sector. I'm working with one of the top 4 banks in New Zealand, and we're quantifying, so regardless of what the local government is doing, we're quantifying the exposure of the portfolio for them across the country. So it might be the residential portfolio, the commercial real estate, the agricultural portfolio. We model the emissions and we model the physical risk. So there are some locations that will be relatively rapidly, you will not be able to get a mortgage in. There are some industries already where the banks are refusing to lend to people because of their business that they work in. So they're classed as sunset industries that you work in. So first time ever in Australia, I've seen people refuse to mortgage because their association with thermal coal, and they work in the thermal coal space. So this is presenting significant risks, to broader society. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to be prepared for it. Transition risks, as I said, for council, for Moreton Bay, these are the things that I would worry about. So insurance for council's part of a collective mutual liability scheme. That's for its liability risks. Most councils, bar one, I think, are part of that process. Councils are also part of a mutual scheme, majority of them, for physical risks. However, they have to go to Zurich and they have to go to London to get the reinsurers. And the reinsurers who I've worked with are asking interesting questions. So another reason to respond to climate change and to show that you're doing responding will help that insurance. If that insurance goes up, then that comes on to the rate payers, right? So the rates go up because somebody has to pay for this at the end of the day. The Queensland Audit Office put a shot across the bow just on the beginning of COVID, you know, so it'll be interesting to see what comes now as that sort of dies down a bit. So the Queensland Audit Office said that all organisations within Queensland, such as state agencies, and, you know, lifeline utilities, as well as local governments, if climate change is a material risk to the organisation, then that should be reflected in the long-term financial plans. That makes sense. That's good accounting. That is coming via this TCFD that you may have heard about. It's called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's a really long acronym, but that is actually, I think, changing the world at the moment. Councils have investments. So, you know, many councils have investments. Do they have an investment policy? Are they investing in carbon? Are they investing in property on the Gold Coast? You know, so you have to be careful about councils' investments. Really important. Councils' income, rateable income. Often your property prices are a really key indicator or a key driver of rates and rateable income. If you have a certain number of homes that can't get insurable, can't get insurance, can't get a mortgage, what does that do to the property prices? What does it do when your CBD goes underwater? So, you know, what does it do to the broader economy? So what does it mean for council's income stream? Carbon exposure. At the moment, we don't really have a carbon price. We've got a little proxy weird thing going on the side. In New Zealand, there's a carbon price. As I said, do a lot of work in New Zealand. The EU's got a significant carbon price. You know, the US, depending on what state you're in, it's all getting turned on. It's not if, it's when Australia will get a carbon price. And so if council hasn't gone net zero sooner rather than later, then it's exposed to carbon. The biggest way of treating a carbon risk with a carbon price is to be net zero, an absolute zero in your emissions. And there's also the legal risk, as was mentioned earlier. So this is the way forward. And what I wanted to do as well is I want to leave you with slides, one slide that you should be asking council, you know, as ratepayers and as residents of your council. So the way forward is, it's been spoken about today. So you need leadership, absolutely need leadership, but you also need good governance. So I'm a governance specialist. That's what I do. I drill down to governance mechanisms and I unpack that line of evidence that's justifying why somebody's making a decision, because that's really, really important. So often you'll see councils declaring a climate emergency. Some councils might be doing some good actions, but if it's not in the governance mechanisms, then nobody can be held account. It's not transparent. And then also, if what often happens within a local government, especially if it's a smaller local government, you'll get one person who's really leading the charge. But if they get, I used to say get hit by a bus, but it's better if they go get another job, right? So if they go and get another job, then that council, you know, the capacity is gone. And at the moment around climate change and skill, capacity and leadership, there's an absolute dearth in any skill sets in that space. You need to understand the risks. So council's done some climate change risk assessments. I did Caboolture Council's climate change risk assessment in 2008. I then did Moreton Bay Regional Council's climate change risk assessment in 2009, and have done some other work in that process. So, you know, I employ to look online, see what we can find, ask some questions in that space. Once you identify the risk, you have to respond to it. And critically, that's been mentioned before, what Dale was talking about is monitoring and evaluating the risk, tracking where things are at. Those metrics are really, really important. They all don't need to be KPIs. You just need to understand where things are shifting, how the dial is shifting, and have some KPIs associated with it. And critically, disclose the risk. And that's to the community, but also to the broader economy, so everyone can understand what is going on. And that is being driven by that TCFD process. I'm working with Auckland City Council at the moment where they're doing their climate change disclosures. Now they have to do it. That's the difference. So in New Zealand, there's new legislation that's come about where organisations, depending on the size of the organisation, depending on how exposed they are to the financial sector, they must disclose, and failure to disclose actually has criminal convictions against directors in that space. So we haven't got there yet, but watch this space because everyone's looking at New Zealand and things are moving really quickly. Often I say it's just like being on the plane. You know, put the gas mask over yourself first, or oxygen mask over yourself first. And any emergencies, the council needs to understand where it's at. And I'm going to, actually, this is one thing council does have, Moreton Bay Council does have a climate change policy, right? So I don't know how many of you know that, but it does, and in the policy it says that climate change should be considered in decisions. That was updated quite recently. Importantly, climate change is in the corporate plan. Now that is how councils discharge their responsibilities under the Act. So that's really, really important. It's good to see that they have that. That's in the new corporate plan. So that's actually really, really important and gives you something to hold them account to. So governance, so the types of questions there's a thing called the QCRC, it's a Queensland Climate Resilient Councils initiative. There's been almost 50 councils have participated in that process. That's in Queensland. Many of those councils, or at least 50 councils, have had a climate change governance assessment. I would be asking your council, have you had a climate change governance assessment? What were the results of that assessment? And how did it go? How do they compare to others? If they haven't done it, why haven't they done it? I would be asking that question. And this is where I wanted to, the questions that I think are really important that you should be asking is ask council, how are they quantifying their climate related risks and opportunities? So you want to know, what have they done? How are they doing it? How is council transitioning to a low carbon economy? So is it a motherhood statement? Is it a stage approach? Have they got 5-year increments in that journey? What resourcing are they giving to implement that transition? How is council maintaining oversight of the issue? So how often is somebody within the elected body of council asking questions around climate change? Is it on the council report to say that what is the climate related decision associated with that? Auckland Council, for example, any decision that goes to council they have to unpack what does that mean in terms of climate change, both on a greenhouse gas side, but also on a physical risk side. So everybody is aware of what is going on. And how are they communicating the results of any risk assessment or any governance assessment or of any activity that they are doing with ratepayers and the community? Because that's the most important thing. I think, Brendon and I were talking before, it's all about accountability and transparency. The difference, I think, from what I see between Australia and New Zealand is that in New Zealand, everything is live feed on YouTube. Everything is out there. The Risk and Audit Committee, it's, all the dirty laundry is aired. And there's pros and cons in that process. And I think we need to push that some more. I'm going to leave it there, though. Just encourage you to reach out and, open it up for conversation.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Thank you.
G'day everyone, my name's Dale Martin. I'm the author of the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit. So this toolkit now, it's at version 2. Originally, version 1 was written at the end of my council term. So I finished council in 2020 after a 4-year term, decided not to run again. As that pretty picture that Adrian put up of me before, I've got many a grey hair now as a result of that term on council. But version 2.0 is now available. It's free. I wrote it really for a number of different reasons, but really I wanted to put the ideas and the actions in the hands of councillors, council staff and community members, because it's something that is really, really important and something that should be shared. So I encourage anyone and everyone to download a copy, share it and steal things from it and implement it in your councils. So basically, really wanting to highlight, it's obvious from the discussion tonight that we are in a climate and also a biodiversity emergency that requires urgent action. Councils across Australia cumulatively spend tens of billions of dollars annually. And so there's money to be spent and money to be spent in the right way. Councillors in particular are very time poor, and that was my experience anyway. It is, incredibly challenging when you're getting hit with, hundreds, if not thousands of emails and phone calls a month trying to, deal with the current agenda, but then also trying to put forward a proactive agenda as well. And so you can get overwhelmed as a councillor, and so writing this toolkit really provides that cut and paste option for councillors. It's also hard to measure success, and Adrian touched on it before, but there is a very strange dynamic between the staff of a council and the council group, and there's sort of a managing up process as well as a managing down process. And so it can be quite challenging, especially with all the personalities that you have. And so having really defined targets and defined KPIs, I think, are really important to measure success in this space. Obviously, every council operates differently. They have different priorities depending on their constituents. But it is one thing that councils, once you have one or two councils do something and other neighbouring councils hear about it, it catches like wildfire. So it is something that I experienced down here, and something that that we've really done a lot of work, in particular in Victoria, but also WA, in New South Wales now. And interestingly, my toolkit in the last 12 months, the most downloads I've had have been in New South Wales, in Queensland, and in the UK. So it's quite interesting. And obviously the system's very complex. There's lots of moving parts, lots of plans. And so trying to work out, well, where should my attention go? So this is a snapshot of the 46 actions recommended in the toolkit. Really, I've broken it into the 7 different areas. So the transparency and accountability section, really, I'd summarize that as the culture of the council. That's talking about setting the target. That's talking about developing an emergency response, and then a range of different initiatives in there to really demonstrate the transparency of council management and operations. We've got the communication piece, which is really talking about publicly declaring, communicating with your residents. One of the ones in particular, which I was really surprised with, was, being in Moreland, we had fantastic existing initiatives, but one of the things that we weren't doing was we weren't communicating in any other languages other than English. And so that's a huge opportunity if there's residents that are missing out. You really need to tweak your communication strategy there. Energy, this is, tends to be the one that most councils are already working on, and most people can wrap their head around, but there's definitely things in that space like community bulk buys, looking at community energy, looking at power purchase agreements. Those sort of things are definitely things that you can do, and they're very, very achievable. And in most cases, they end up saving residents and councils money. So it's really a no-brainer. Looking at transport as well, and really across energy, transport, and the other areas, really trying to actually, well, put your money where your mouth is and dedicate a percentage of your budget to some of these initiatives. Because I found that one of the things as a councillor is we would pass a motion and we'd get a report back and we'd all agree to it. But then come budget time, it wasn't in there. And so really dedicating a percentage of the budget to have initiatives roll out, I think, is really, really important, particularly to hold the organisation to account. So we're looking at transport, active transport, looking at a fleet policy, looking at opportunities for bulk buys for your residents as well, and staff in particular. Circular economy being the next area. Again, there's been a lot of work in the space, in particular down here in Victoria of late. But circular economy, really, some of the things that I worked on before I was a councillor were the single-use plastic bag bans in supermarkets. That was one of the campaigns that we run down here, as well as the cash for containers campaigns. I did see a few ads on the telly when I was up there a couple of weeks back, and so it's great to see that a lot of these initiatives are being rolled out by the state, but there is so much more that local councils can do, particularly when it comes to procurement, and particularly when it comes to things like standard asset specifications. These are options that can be changed with a stroke of a pen, and they have pretty significant impacts when it comes to buying recycled. Industry and built environment, again, ESD, we've seen the state ministers talking about this recently, which is fantastic. Talking about engaging a business community, I think is really important in this space. And then finally, open space and agriculture, really looking at urban heat, looking at your food system strategies, and really thinking about food security as something that we need to really prioritize moving forward, but then also access to open space and local biodiversity. So really quickly, I'm just going to take you through how to read the toolkit. So when you download it, what you've got here is the objectives. So this is one of 46 objectives within the toolkit. You've got the level of ambition in here. So 1-star, 2-star, 3-star. Ideally, we would have every single council in Australia have a 1-star action, and then we'd be arguing between 1, 2, and 3. The reality is even the councils that were some of the first to declare a climate emergency have probably only completed around half of the actions, and it's different in different councils. And so there's not any council in Australia or any level of government that can say they don't have any ideas or there's nowhere to go. There's definitely room to improve in every aspect. This document also talks about who can make the decisions, the key documents. In here, you'll see council plan, but I know it's called corporate plan where you guys are. The method, how you would do it as a councillor, and then the expected outcome, and really what are we trying to achieve at the end of the day with each of these objectives. So I've just whipped through a couple of really quick examples just to take you through. So one of the suggested actions here is for councillors to embed measurable climate emergency KPIs into the CEO's contract. It's something that not a lot of people think about, but there is, a CEO, chief executive in every council, and the opportunity for them to be working towards something that they are measured against. I think that this is a really, really important one and something that's been missed. And I think we're starting to see in the corporate sector this being picked up, and some CEOs are sort of voluntarily including some of these types of KPIs, but this is something that you could speak with your councillors, and I think it's very reasonable. The contracts are reviewed quite frequently, and so it's something very reasonable that could be implemented, which will then drive that culture change within a council. Another example is the energy bulk buy. So talking about council simply facilitating a biennial asset bulk buy program for residents and businesses. This is really council acting as an aggregator in this space, and then providing it to their residents, providing it to their staff, and then the opportunity to collaborate with other councils in the area for even greater economies of scale. And this again is something that's very simple and really quite cheap to do. Another option in here is looking at the procurement policy. Again, I mentioned before that councils spend an awful lot of money each year. And so, one of the things that you can do is you can say, well, what's the social and environmental benefit of where we're spending? Councils down here in Victoria have what's called a tech notes, which is an asset specifications and a standard set of specifications for every single park bench, table, barbecue, street light, everything, road, you name it. There's a set of specifications. And so it's quite simple to mandate a percentage of recycled content in there. And again, this is something that can be simply included by a councillor as a notice of motion or calling for a report working with officers as part of a review. So that's all I really wanted to talk to tonight. I'm happy to take any questions after this, but I think one of the things, I encourage everyone to download a copy and hoping that I can't tell why Adrian's talking, but I'll mute myself now. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to hit me up afterwards.
Good, thank you. Right, without further ado, Adrian Whitehead. Adrian's co-founder of Beyond Zero Emissions, and community action for the climate emergency. Played a significant role in inspiring Darebin City Council to create the world's first climate emergency plan, which led to the creation of community action for the climate emergency to encourage and support other councils.
So I suppose what I'm talking to is why should a council declare a climate emergency? I just want to acknowledge David Law from Sunshine Coast Council, who was instrumental in getting that declaration through that council. So thanks very much, David. And being the second Queensland council. We had any more since? No. Going for the third, obviously. Excellent. All right. So why should Moreton Bay Regional Council declare a climate emergency? I'm going to look at it from a few points. That's a summary. It's an emergency. It's a global movement. We can drive positive local action, legal responsibility, leadership is needed, and your council's legacy. So we'll flash through that and then probably can ask some questions at the end as well. A bit of history. So the reason this all came about was a bunch of activists in Melbourne, myself included, decided that we'd sort of given up on state and federal politicians. And we thought, we've got a really climate aware council, and we've been working away on climate change in our council area for quite a while. And we thought we could bend the arms of our councillors to make a climate emergency declaration. Now, what we were hoping they would do would then dive in with all the council resources and attempt to save the world, right? Now, has anyone done that anywhere in the world yet, do you think? No. Okay, so big fail on the second part two, but part two is still to come, right? But part one's good enough, and we'll go through why that's still it's not good enough, but every step forward is a step forward, and we've got to acknowledge that. So they're all the councillors that declared, and look at them. They're all just normal people. You know, you've got to work out your play for your particular council. And we just happen to get a big chunk of Greens, a person who cares a lot about people, a person who realised it was a thing, like we want Darebin to be first, and that's why she did. She didn't really understand what it was, but she wanted to be first. This person cares about the old people. All right. So, and the person who voted against is not there, or they would have voted against, but they just left the room, right? So they're not in that picture. So we started here, December 2016. Then Yarra Council, and then we got Brian, he worked on Vincent, got Vincent in Perth. We worked Philip Sutton, I'll talk about Philip in the end, but he was working with Americans over years, trying to get them to do it. They had Trump elected, and they were all very depressed, so they thought, why not? And they got Hoboken and Montgomery, and then somewhere in here they got Los Angeles, and then when they got Los Angeles, we got the world, right? So it took off from there. Yeah, so that's, and then the UK, a person in Bristol did it in UK, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's a bit of the history. So what is a declaration? It's pretty simple. There is two key parts: an acknowledgement and a commitment to act. It doesn't have to be complex. This is the very first one. The council recognises that we're in a state of climate emergency that requires urgent action by all levels of government, including local councils. All right, so if anyone's looking for a motion on the case website, we've got a whole section so you can see examples, etc., on the case website. And then once the council's declared, they're recorded by Sedamia. So that was set up by Philip Sutton, Margaret Hender, and it was two people. Then Philip stepped back, and Margaret runs this by herself, and she records all the declarations in the world, just as a volunteer. So, and does other work around it as well. But you have to pass Margaret to get on that. So big question is, do we have the solutions? Because I think one really important thing about climate change is if you don't, like anything, so if you've got a really bad medical condition, if there's not a pathway of treatment, people get depressed, shut down, and walk away, right? So in climate change, we instinctively always paired problem with solutions. And if it's a big problem, if you say go and change a light globe, what do people do? They'll switch off because they know changing light globes ain't going to do it when you've got 30% of your state's power being used by one aluminium smelter, for example, right? So you've got to do big solutions. So we set up a thing called Beyond Zero Emissions. That's the website. And one of the world's first think tanks, me and Matthew Wright, is looking at fast transitions for whole sectors of the economy. And pretty much we did the first 100% renewable energy plan in a 10-year speed. A Welsh group had done a 25-year transition plan before us, but we did the sort of first 10-year one, and we did the first Australian one. Why declare? So a whole bunch of reasons. It's an emergency. So if you followed what Brendon said, it is an emergency. But if you want someone else, this is a picture of Will Steffen, as you can see there. He said to Sunshine Coast Council, when I spoke and Donovan spoke to them, it was the fastest rise in CO2 and temperature other than when the big meteorite hit that killed the dinosaurs, right? So that's it. We're outside of global history effectively, right? In terms of a natural sort of flowing process versus a bang acute impact. And he called it an emergency for the planet. And of course you don't, you can have the expertise of Brendon convince you, but I think one of the things that didn't surprise me, but I was happy to see in my early climate campaigning days, average people just walking up to me and saying, the weather's changed. This is weird. This is before the super fire events and the floods and everything we've had in the last few years. But people get it, and they get it at some level. Particularly farmers get it, actually. Farmers who have been on the land for a long time will know that climate has been changing. So whether it's, part of Gold Coast falling into the ocean, the massive fires, the repeated bleaching of the reef faster than it can heal, etc., we know it's already emergency. Emergency versus crisis, I think language is really important. We fought the mainstream environment movement for 10 years to use the word emergency. We won in the end because the councils backed us and it became the thing, went global. But even now, people still like using the word crisis versus emergency. Crises can be managed. They can be dealt with over time. Emergencies require acute, immediate response in order to prevent a disaster from unfolding. And I would even argue we're actually at the point of rescue now, but that's not going to work out there in the public, where we are now rescuing ourselves from an event that we've put in place. And the UN took it even further and called it an existential threat to humanity. They didn't mean all humans would die. They meant human systems and social systems would collapse under the weight of climate change. That's my interpretation of what they said. It's following on from what Brendon said about the pathways. If we look at Paris commitments, some people are estimating the commitments will take us to 3 degrees. And if we're looking at what's being executed is less than the commitments, it's going to take us above 3 degrees. So that's a bit scary. All right. And if we go above 2, as Brendon said, it's pretty nasty. If we go above 3, it's sort of literal Mad Max sort of stuff. All right. I'd really love this one to work, so I'm going to just pause until it comes through. There's a great series of psychological experiments. If you have a couple of actors, for example, two researchers who just sit there as the room's filling with smoke, only 10% of people will go, excuse me, there's something going on. Can we call the ambulance or fire brigade or whatever? If there's 2 random participants, only 40% of people will do it. I think we're in this sort of the room's filling with smoke. And this is part of this climate emergency declaration thing, because it is part of that, because every council we get, every council that comes up with a new climate emergency plan, a process of engaging their community through their new plan, etc., even if it's not full mobilisation, is another step forward. Yeah, it's another normalisation of this is serious. All right, and this is just my little unpacking of how I think the collapse is going to unfold if we don't stop it. So we're in this phase at the moment: floods, storms, fires, coastal inundation, erosion, getting worse and worse. The food systems are going to, and I think we're starting this phase. Then mass migration following the food crises, and then there'll be a net global food deficit. Countries will decide whether to force project and capture food producing areas. A country like Australia that makes 200-300% more food than needs is a potential, forced projection target at some point. So we started a global movement. So why not add your voice? Like, we're going to be talking about a republic soon. People got a choice of adding their voice or not adding their voice. That's the graph. There's now 2,270 councils, governments, the UN, states like Ireland, South Australia, the ACT have all declared. There's a nice map of them around the world. And so there's been lots of declarations, even the Pope. And that's really good. Like, that's fantastic, because he communicates to an entire sector of people right throughout the world in a way that, it's a magnifying voice. So it's been good. So in Australia, we've got 112 councils, 21%, still got a lot to go, the ACT and South Australia. It can drive councils to take positive action. So Dale's going to be talking in a bit, assuming the technology doesn't collapse on us. And Dale's done this wonderful piece of work called the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit. And pretty much where we get lost in my mind is we do the declaration and everyone instantly just goes, I want to do something practical and, you know, small. Whereas what I want them to do is something noisy and symbolic, but also practical. Does that make sense? So I want the emergency, not the 10 tons of carbon and the solar panels. I can have both, but I need the emergency to make it work. Because without that framing, we're not pushing forward into an emergency response from government. So Dale's going to talk about all the great practical stuff. There's just some of the great things you can do. And for example, I'm sure Dale might talk about it, but in Victoria, we had 40 something councils sign on to a wind farm, massive production of wind farms. Even if the council didn't declare it, they don't believe in climate change, guess what happens to the electricity price if they signed up to it? It drops rather dramatically and they get cheaper electricity. So it's just the most economic, rational thing to do, regardless of whether you care about climate change. And that's true for so much, including streetlights, which apparently councils don't control particularly well. They don't have control of it in Queensland, do they? No. In Victoria, all the councils are changing their streetlights. Saves them money, saves power, reduces their emissions. All right, so for example, Queenscliff Borough Council declared and got excited, wrote a plan and reduced their emissions by 73% in 1 year. That's an example of what they did.
What year did they declare?
Not too long ago, I was there. It's probably, yeah, there you go. No, that was their plan. I think it was 2019. It might have been just in COVID, but yeah. Councils, why declare? Councils' legal responsibilities. Can councils declare is a question we often get asked. And under Queensland Local Government Act, a councillor must represent the current and future interests of residents of their local government area. And in terms of action, this is Queensland again, a local government has the power to do anything that is necessary or convenient for the good rule and local government of its local government area. That's pretty broad as far as I'm concerned. And that's in the Act at sections 12.1 and 9.1. We end up with people like this guy and like actively undermining international efforts, to someone who's come up with really good targets, but it's going to open 100 coal and gas mines, to the first ever world electric vehicle tax. Yay, right? You know, and opening up gas fields all in the South Coast as well. You know, I assume bad things are going on in Queensland. Now, this is the bit I'm trying to get across. It's like, currently it's a silent emergency, and emergencies aren't silent, are they? There's like sirens and, you know, warnings and, you know, please evacuate and all that sort of stuff. So this is that council that did the best, right? Can anyone see an emergency on this council? No. It looks very nice. This is COVID, right? So COVID had huge images, ads, rolling pictures, banners. There's Sunshine Coast had, you know, this is late in the piece, had a banner permanently on the top of the website. This looks like an emergency. So every council in Australia has, you know, literally thousands of examples of an emergency response now that they could lift from COVID and translate straight to a climate emergency response in terms of messaging at least. And, you know, one thing I'd like to say, if for councillors, just think about this is a picture of a large truck sandbagging the beaches somewhere, and no amount of sandbagging is going to stop it, right? Stop a little bit of it, but then it's just going to overtop it. And this is a picture of two lovely girls holding a sign saying, "Make the earth cool again," at a protest. They're about 9, all right? So where does it end? On the case website, we've got a whole section on how a council can enter emergency mode, which is the whole point of getting the declaration of a climate emergency, right? And finally, hopefully this one comes. So this is a picture of Philip Sutton. He's the person I started campaigning on zero emissions back in 2003. So it's me, Matthew Wright, Philip Sutton, who campaigned on zero emissions back in 2003. And we didn't mean net zero. What did we mean? Absolute zero, real zero. Yeah, a real zero. And at the very start of June, after the federal election, I've been taken up with election time, and he's talking about climate rescue. So we're going to launch a climate rescue campaign in Philip's name and try and pick up some of his last campaign plans and stuff. And it's just, I'm just flagging it. If you want to get in touch, we're trying to build a network around it. And it's about getting everyone into emergency mode, because we're not going to reverse global warming unless we're in full emergency mode. And it seems the governments are much more comfortable spending billions of dollars in flood, fire, etc. damage than spending the billions of dollars that they need to reverse it. All right. Thank you very
much. Do we have any questions? We've got about half an hour until we've got to vacate the room. It'll probably take us all of 5 minutes to vacate the room, so that leaves us a decent amount of time to have some questions. I don't know if anybody's got a burning one to start with. I've got plenty I could ask if not.
I had a couple of questions for the person. About the summary for policymakers.
Yeah.
I think you were saying that the IPCC report is pure science and not political. But in the summary for policymakers, that was collaboration between the authors and government representatives. Can you explain how that is not political?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there is no governmental interference in the full report. Right? It stands under this peer review process that governments participate in. But the scientists do the assessment. The summary for policymakers is actually a translation exercise of the science into policy speak. So it's not actually a scientific, it's not the language of science. It's literally like translating from English to French. We're translating science into policy relevant language. And that is actually, if you like, a joint exercise. So the science authors do the first draft, and then there's this 2-week plenary where we go through each statement and each sentence, and because it's not the exact language that's in the report, so the government say, well, where's the evidence for that statement? We show them, and they say, well, you'll use this adjective, but does the evidence support this adjective? Should we use that adjective? Right? So it's a very difficult, time-consuming process, especially through Zoom when the Secretary's in Bond. So for us, we're 2 weeks shutting the up all night. But the advantage of that is that at the end of the day, you've got a document that's in language that governments can understand, because the 3,700 page report is written in very, very, very precise scientific language that you can understand.
I've read that many scientists have been angered by the watering down by the politicians of what the science has said.
Well, I would disagree, because a full report stands alone. No one waters down the full report, right? So that is completely false statement to make about the full report. The SPM is designed to be a jointly drafted document. It cannot alter the science, but what's in there has to be fully supported by the science. But in that translation, there's legitimate debate about phrasing and languages. But I think anyone who reads the summary for policymakers, you cannot say it's watered down. I don't know how you can say it's watered down the report. It's all three working groups, I would argue, are the strongest wording of any of the assessments, because the science just gets stronger. So, yes, there's, I would argue, kind of legitimate debate about the summary for policymakers, but no one touches the full report. I mean, it just stands as it is.
Sure.
My criticism of the IPCC is that each one has said conditions are worse than what we expected with the previous one. And going back to 2 previous ones where one of the people responsible for the reports, was at a meeting that I went to. They asked him about this, and he said they're obliged in effect to study the extremes in coming up with their reports.
No, I would disagree. That's not true. What the main limitation is what I said at the beginning. The methodology is based on assessing what's in primarily peer-reviewed scientific journals. You can only assess what's been researched and published, and the research is limited because, let's face it, 90% of research funding goes to military purposes. 9% of the rest goes to medical research. There's a sliver that goes to the environment and a sliver that goes to climate research, right? So the research is very limited, especially about projecting into the future. The models are very, there's big limitations in understanding the system. So the big gap is about tipping points, right? Like we don't, scientifically, we know these tipping points exist. They're well documented, but they're not well understood in scientific terms, in terms of how you can mathematically model these physical processes. One of the big gaps is with what's happening in Antarctica. Of course, there's bugger all research into Antarctica. And what's happening, like how, when's the tipping point in terms of the Antarctic ice shelf? Well, we know there must be because there's been records about the geological past, but there's bugger all research into actually the physical processes. So if the research isn't done, you can't build that into the models. So the models are limited. And the big problem is modelling extremes. It's limited scientific understandings of extremes. So it's true, the science is limited, in particularly about extremes and what tipping points are. It's not the fault of the science, it's not the fault of the IPCC. If you're going to blame anyone, it's a lack of investment in the climate science. And the scientists have been screaming for decades about getting more funding to be able to accelerate that research. But there are that's your basic problem.
John, have you got another question?
Yes, another question. The last slide that you put up, I think it was 1.7 and 3 maybe, and it was 300 to 900 gigatons per annum.
Yes, so
my question is, are you able to quantify that for me? Like, for example, how many Carmichael mines would be 300 gigatons?
Well, what was on the slide I didn't have time to show, because that's in the first IPCC report, is what's called the carbon budget. Remaining carbon budget for different levels of global warming, right? So the remaining, which is how much carbon, how much more carbon, here it is here. So this is, this shows you the likelihood, because it's scientific, it's modeled, these are probabilities, of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, 1.7 or 2 degrees. And what the size of the remaining carbon budget is for like that's the permissible emissions. That's how much carbon we've got to burn from the beginning of 2020. And you often hear people say 50%. My God, why would you pick 50%? Like if you're doing a risk assessment, why would you pick 50%? You wouldn't, would you?
No.
Well, here we've got 83%. So to limit global warming to, no more than 1.5 degrees, we've got 300 gigaton of CO2, and we do about 34 gigaton a year at the moment. So if we continue just at the current rate, growing each year still, even if we keep at the current rate, what's 300 divided by what is it? About eight years. It's if you wanted to say, okay, we'll allow it to go to 2 degrees, you've got 900. Well, that's still only 25 years. So, however you look at it, even if you say, okay, let's limit it to 2 degrees, there's somewhere between 8 to 25 years worth of current emissions. Now, your question was how many Carmichael. Well, it is possible to calculate if how much coal is in there, and it's because it depends on the quality and how it's burned, blah blah blah. But yeah, but you know, people do those calculations. I don't know that number, but that's the carbon budget in terms of 1.5 to 2 degrees. It's 8 to 25 years worth of current emissions.
Wow.
Total global net, and these are net emissions, annual net emissions.
So what we should be saying perhaps is that we should be achieving all of this by 2030, not 2050 or 2050.
Absolutely. We need to be net zero emissions by 2030, not 2050.
So,
and the net zero is, again, there's been a great political misuse of the concept of net zero emissions. It makes sense at a global scale because on an annual basis, a third of all CO2 emissions are absorbed by the ocean, and about a third is absorbed by natural forests, etc. But 99% of that is degassed within a year, right? So there's the natural carbon cycle, global carbon cycle. The oceans are absorbing and degassing, so you can't talk about zero emissions because on an annual basis the oceans is degassing and forests respire carbon. So from the scientific point of view, you talk about net zero emissions, but governments have taken that and industry have taken that, and it's actually got a different meaning now, right? We're actually talking about zero fossil fuel emissions, so that globally the global carbon cycle can have net zero emissions.
Anybody else? Question? We've got another 10 minutes. We could probably, before we need to pack up.
Can I speak?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
we are, yeah.
Mine is more an observation than a question, and it's about my question. I've listened to Don, I've listened to everybody, and what are the levers we can actually use with Moreton Bay Regional Council about actually persuading them, convincing them about a climate emergency? So, you know, you talk about insurance. Just think in the last 6 months, all of those people in Brisbane and Lismore who don't have insurance, they've given up on insurance. They can't afford insurance. So what's Moreton Bay going to do? They've already tried to have a flood plan, and everybody was up in arms, oh, that's not going to happen. And so they went and changed it again. So I'm not sure exactly where the Moreton Bay is now with that sort of thing. What is the, you know, we walk in and say, oh, it's so bad, we've got to do something. But they're rational thinkers and they want really, really hardcore evidence. The other thing was around waste. The other thing, the council could save so much money by putting solar on every single building they have. Every showground should have buildings, that every single one. And it's really practical. And they say, oh, it's so expensive. It's not expensive when you look at the benefits. So yeah, I'm just really keen, Donovan, what you think about that.
Yeah, I think so. I've worked with maybe 300 or so councils around Australia, and traditionally climate conversations were framed in environmental / social space, and it unfortunately didn't take hold. As things have changed now, because it's materialising as a financial issue, that's, I think, the most important one, is to ask councils to justify their decision making financially. So you want to see where climate change is. So every local government has to do a 10-year long-term financial plan, an annual financial plan. So have a look at that and see, how do you think, you know, which line items could be affected by climate change, and ask the council, how have they considered those line items and how could they be affected by climate change? Where is climate change in the council's risk register, and what actions are they doing to unpack that? I think that one thing that we found is that very few people in the sort of finance, so CFOs around Australia, they don't know nothing about climate change. You know, the accounting standards are changing, which is good, but it's really important to ask questions around financial, because you know, regardless of whatever your stance is environmentally or socially, everybody usually cares about their pocket, yeah, and it's going to have an impact on your available online.
So what's the best way to pressurise council for us?
I think ask questions. You know, those questions that I had asked them, like when they say, "Oh, it's too expensive to do," they say, "Well, why?" You know, like the question might be, you know, they might make an announcement and say they've got 2 electric cars or something. You know, but is that enough to decarbonise the organisation? Ask them for the evidence to show the cost-benefit analysis that they've undertaken for this and what that might mean.
I like the comment that who made it about the CEO has to have in his contract KPIs, something about climate change that has to be achieved. Now, I think that relates also to a lot of other organisations. I'm involved with the school board. Oh yeah, we talk about risk matrix, so there's nothing in there about climate change.
Apologies, I didn't really get the last bit of that conversation, but I think one of the things that I've been working with a lot of residents across the country on, and that is really understanding the levels of government and the levels of influence within a council. There's some councils where the council group is quite strong, quite aware, and they really do call all the shots. Other councils where the executive is really the driving force, and really the relationship between the executive and the staff of the council. You might have the opportunity to pull aside a sustainability officer or the head of the sustainability department, have a conversation with them and actually say, you know, here's the 10 things that I think we should be doing. What are our chances of actually getting this through, working from the officer level up the council and putting it forward as reports? And then the other way is, you know, having a conversation with the CEO or the executive, or having a conversation with the councillors and saying, do you think these things are reasonable? And then that will really give you the strategy as to how you might try and push this thing through. You might find that the most effective way is to work bottom up within the council. And so just I would really encourage having those conversations with as many of the people within the council to really get an idea of who are your allies and how to get stuff through.
Yeah. One of the problems who have been left on councillors' desks, not answered in a timely manner. So it's getting them cornered, getting in that position where they have to be accountable. One avenue I think we could pursue is the opportunity as a citizen to address council, because they allow that as a part of their process. And that, Donovan, you may think of doing that at some stage. Because obviously it's easier to embarrass government, embarrass any group, if they're in their group rather than individually, so we can face them up. There's this lovely example I saw of in the States of some farmers whose land was going to be fracked on, and they got some water from the land and presented this fracking committee that were assessing. None of them would drink it. That was a very powerful way of bringing them together. And so things that we can do like that, I think we all agree that we need transformative action. It's just we need to see what are the increments that we can do to take that. It has to be increments to get that transformative action.
And sadly, my experience with campaigning, and every time we've won, it's been leverage. And leverage is power. And in the case of councillors, it's, but you know, whether they're worried about being re-elected, and they'll do a cost-benefit analysis and say, is this issue going to cost me more votes than I'm going to get? So it's about building up those hard slog broad campaigns where they just see, they keep seeing more and more climate emergency posters in the community, and there's protests and there's the actions, and you just build it up. And over time, you know, you might win or you might not, but sometimes doing that we had Knox, which is a very redneck council in Melbourne. We got one climate councillor in, and they huge community effort, thousands of protests, but there were 2 cycles of motions, and eventually it got up. But that work had preset the possibility of the success, even though there was really only one really strong councillor supporting it. So
that financial thing. You know, I've seen a council of 12 elected members who had 4 climate skeptics 100% endorse climate policy because of fear of litigation and financial accountability.
You will be sued, yes.
John?
I'm just thinking about Dale's point of working bottom up through the council. It reminded me of a couple of things that we did in the Sunshine Coast that I think were really quite effective in terms of making a relationship with some key staff. One was we had a climate roulette wheel with 5 quadrants on it. One was a declaration, the others were disasters. And the staff would spin it, and if they got the declaration, we gave them a coffee voucher. We across the road to the coffee shop. We made some good connections with people through that. Another small group of 3 were conducting a weekly sort of vigil in the forecourt outside of the council in the afternoons. And increasingly, just sitting there quietly with a couple of signs, they found that council staff were coming up and engaging in conversations, particularly the ones who, you know, are positively in favour of climate action, but not only. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but I think that what Dale was saying is a good way to go.
Yeah. Okay, well, got 6 minutes till 7, so we perhaps better. Got one last question? John?
I just I'm not quite sure who to put this to, but Moreton Bay region is one of the bigger local government areas, and it's closely linked to Brisbane as well, and it's also pretty rapidly growing. And I mean, just casting about myself in the last month or 2, I've noticed that there's been a planning coming from zero position really. I've noticed that there's been on the planning horizon talk of a major new town in southwest Caboolture, which is, you know, presumably between here and wedged up beneath the range. And further to that, there's been there's still ongoing consultation approach, probably run by Transport, for a new duplication of the Bruce Highway, which would come in somewhere near Caboolture from further up north. Now, it was duplicating the fragmentation caused by the Bruce Highway in the first place. But those are really big issues, and you know, and in theory, they're very relevant to climate change and climate change response. So they may, the fact that sort of thing is happening might predispose some people within the council to not adopt a new rod for their backs. So I'm just wondering amongst the speakers who care to comment on that, what that means for how a Climate Action Network might approach council and what ambit they would take.
The ambit for me would be around cost benefit, so, and also the modelling. So, you know, there's been lots of development occurring in the Moreton Bay region that is risk areas under climate change. That's a legal risk for council decision making. There's issues around the carbon, as well in terms of roads and so on. So then I'll just be asking for the climate-related cost benefit and conversations and all the decisions that they've made associated with them. But yeah, physical hazards.
But you wouldn't be sort of running up the flagpole hard quantitative targets which relate to major new road infrastructure, for instance.
Well, it comes down to cost, doesn't it? And it depends on who's paying for the road, who's going to service the road. Unfortunately, you know, usually roads end up being might be a public-private partnership, and then it will get discounted down. Yeah, it's might not even be in the hands of council.
Yeah.
Often state development come in and say,
State.
and they've done that to this council before, it's, we're going to put a town here and you're going to approve it.
That's right.
And that usually-
Where Muan, I think, be more that than just the council.
We were mentioning earlier about food security and water security. And I happen to know that, you know, over in Daybury we've got a lot of, as you can imagine, small hobby farms. But it's amazing how many Woolworths and Coles deliver. People are basically living out there because they want a large, they don't want to grow, they don't really want to provide their food. And here we are, you know, we're doing Culture West and we're producing these housing estates, which are essentially covered in house and very little garden area. So looking ahead at our food resilience, we're going to need more and more of the opportunity to be, you know, resilient and grow our own food and develop that culture. Putting my hand up and having green fingers.
It will be taking away a lot of agricultural food productive land when we're at.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. We've got, I think, a quarter of the region, about 500 square kilometres is grazing land, which is by and large very efficient agricultural production. It's extensive grazing, very low calorie production per acre. If that could be converted to the sort of thing, I don't know if anybody's following George Monbiot, what he's talking about with precision fermentation, but potentially you could have 1,250 circular economy villages, which we're looking at, which could accommodate, in theory, 250,000. Increase biodiversity, increase food efficiency, increase water efficiency. But of course, it's how do you create that sort of culture which will accept that sort of transformation. But, I mean, looking at it, it's that huge deficit between what is politically feasible and what we know is scientifically feasible. How do we get that through to our neighbours, our street, our suburb, our friends, our business colleagues, our unions? Yeah, that's what we have to work at, isn't it? Well, thanks, folks. We've got to lock up or tidy up and lock up. Thanks for coming. We'll try and get you close.